Hi, this is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles. Today is September 11th, 2020, the 19th anniversary of the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Quite a somber day. I'm sure it'll be a day the rest of my life that will have that resonance of recalling the images on the screen when we were watching in Casper, Wyoming that morning. So it just never fails to trigger a sense of fragility and also resilience for everything that's happened since then. And hopefully that same resilience at play in the current crises. Meanwhile, back in the world of books, I have an exciting interview to bring to you today. I spoke with Erica Bauermeister, an author from Port Townsend, Washington, whose most recent book, House Lessons, Renovating a Life, was nearly 2 decades in the making because it tracked the renovation of a very old, very rickety house. And it was published this year in March, right as the pandemic was making its debut as something to change everything all over the world. Strangely enough, the insights of the book about home and the quality of life turn out to be very timely indeed, as you'll hear. Also in this episode, I've got some comments that I want to catch up with, and I really appreciate getting email from you. You can send me email at podchronicles@gmail.com. I get ideas for stories and interviews, and I whenever possible, I like to get some of these comments to share with the general community. But even if I don't read an email that you sent me recently, know that I read everything and really appreciate them. So with that, let's turn to the interview. Erica Bauermeister's recent novel, The Scent Keeper, was chosen by Reese Witherspoon. She turns out to be quite a book lover, and she has her own book club. And in February, she picked Erica's book as the book club's main pick of the month. Erica's previous 3 novels, School of Essential Ingredients, Joy for Beginners, and The Lost Art of Mixing, prompted such remarkable enthusiasm and delight in my wife, Darlene, that I decided to reach out to Erica for an interview. I was really glad I was able to connect with her. I have now read her 4th novel, The Scent Keeper, published in February of this year, and I'm more than halfway through her recent memoir, House Lessons, Renovating a Life. I'll tell you, this woman can write. Her prose, I find, is musical, clear, imaginative, graceful. When I commented on this after we stopped recording the interview that you're going to hear, she shared a poignant insight into her talent. She said that her father was literally a rocket scientist and a skilled musician, but Erica herself had no ear for notes. She simply couldn't carry a tune. And as you will hear, she has an unusual way of writing in that she speaks the words as she's writing them. And I think her ability to hear her words may have something to do with her father's ear for music. That's what she was suggesting, I think, when she made that comment. So I love that. That's a nice way of thinking about how gifts move through a family, through the generations. I did enjoy having a chance to visit with this talented author by Skype. We connected from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and her view from her house was the ocean was hidden by the smoke from the forest fires in California. Not a problem that I have here looking out at a clear view of the ocean today on the coast of Maine. I began our conversation by asking if the themes in House Lessons turn out to have any particular resonance with the pandemic, which was just taking off in March when her latest book was released.
You know, it does. And it's kind of funny because the book took me almost 20 years to, from the time that we found the house to all the different versions of the book to the one I finally published. And sometimes timing just happens that way with books. And I do feel like it's the perfect time for this book to come out because we are all hunkered down and we are all being affected by the layout and designs of our houses. And we're trying to figure out how to live better and how to be better in a lot of ways. And it's amazing how much a house can affect that.
What about the house that you spent all that time creating? Has it turned out to be suitable to a pandemic in ways that you couldn't have imagined?
Yes. I mean, the other day, my husband and I, we were taking a walk and we were talking about how many little things had to happen in order for us to be in this place at this time, to be in a small town that feels very safe and to be in a house that is filled with windows so that you feel the outside, you don't feel trapped. I mean, it feels remarkably lucky to be here. And yet at the same time, I'm not a terribly woo-woo person, but it really does feel as if this house grabbed us and made us choose it and stay here all through all the different reasons why we should have left. We stayed, or we kept it. And I think that's, I in some ways it feels like that's why, because we're here now.
Yeah. I love that part of the book where you're sort of giving a name to that sense I've had in different houses. You walk into a house and you just feel it's right. And my most recent experience was my daughter moved from Cambridge to a house in Lexington, and she asked me to go take a look at the house in Lexington before they bought it. And I drove up and it said 15, the address on the mailbox. 15 was the house number of the house I grew up in. And that just triggered this sense of this house will be as right for her as that house was in my childhood. And it was just an almost physical sense of it. But so I've experienced that, but you were also a realtor. And I wonder, did you ever have a time when somebody looked like they were picking up that message from the house and it turned out just to be wrong, that they had somehow been influenced by somebody else's opinion, or they hadn't picked up a clear signal from the house, and maybe you got better at helping people detect if they were picking up a real signal, because you're betting your life and a lot of money on one of these, and it frequently feels sort of irresponsible to put that much weight on something that you don't understand.
That's true. That's true. And okay, so I'm trying to think, interestingly enough, I don't know that I ever saw anybody choose the wrong house. I saw couples have disagreements over what the right house would be, less often than you would think. But really the thing that really got me out of real estate, along with the fact that my first book sold, and so that kind of allowed me to quit real estate. But the thing that I saw was in 2007, was people finding the right house and my knowing it was financially too much for them and the lenders were being predatory. And so I spent most of 2007 saying, please don't buy that. Please don't buy that, which was, you don't make a living as a real estate agent if that's your approach. And in some of those cases, it was, they went ahead because I'm not their mother. And in some cases, it was disastrous. And that broke my heart. And but I never saw that the house was wrong, that connection that the person had, when it was that deep felt instinctive, I don't know why I like this, I just need this house, And so often those houses were nothing like what the people said they wanted. And yet when they saw it, they knew that's what they wanted. Were
there tells that you learned to read, like in a poker game, that when you saw someone, a facial expression or a tone of voice, how did you end up learning that you were in the presence of that kind of information from the house?
People are not, when it comes to that reaction, people are not subtle. I mean, their eyes get big. It either looks like they've fallen in love or they're a child again. I mean, there's something so almost primal about it, where they just know. And it's funny how often it is something like an address, where someone just says, oh, that just feels right. And my guess is that what that really is a tiny manifestation of something much larger, that they're just not able to articulate why they love it. And that's a lot of what House Lessons was for me, was over those 15 years that I spent writing it, learning what, kind of philosophizing and intellectualizing and thinking a lot about what were those initial instinctual reactions that I had? Where did they come from? In an effort to make that a more universal thing that other people could understand in their own lives.
Right. You were kind of decoding that with like some of the research into the different architects, which I found fascinating. The architect who's looking to create their legacy or a vision they don't really care who lives in the house or whether you're going to fit their vision. You luckily found an architect that had a different approach, it sounds like.
Well, and I think that goes both ways. It's both that I believe an architect should be that conduit that helps create the house that suits the people, right? Suits their lives. On the other hand, I also think that people need to understand that they are caretakers of houses, and that a house has its own character to begin with. And I don't believe that it's our job to go in and completely destroy that character simply because we want something different. I think it's important that we choose houses that fit us. If we have to adapt them to how we live now, I don't have a problem with that. But, it always kind of breaks my heart to see some turret stuck on the side of a mid-century modern, or something where, it just because it's yours doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, that's right. There should be some
soul too. It deserves to retain its character.
Yeah, absolutely. In the virtual launch video that you did for House Lessons, you said that you and your husband Ben had spent these years renovating, and that the house was like a marriage counselor. And I'm thinking, if you think back on those sessions with your house as a marriage counselor, was there one dominant bit of advice that the house was giving to you as a couple?
Oh, sure. I do think that doing a renovation is a real stressor on a marriage. And we did a particularly interesting one in that we flipped our roles. I had been staying at home. I didn't become a real estate agent until after we did the renovation. So at the time, I was a stay-at-home mom. I was a writer, but it was very back channel kind of things. And my husband was the one at work. So we had this very traditional marriage, which we had never intended to have and which I desperately wanted to flip. And so when this house showed up, it was 2 hours away from our house where we lived in Seattle. And so the person who was overseeing that project was necessarily going to be away from the house for days at a time. And I took that role on. My husband became dad on deck. He was working from home at the time. And that really kind of changed things up. But in terms of what the house itself taught us, there's one chapter, and I probably get more letters about this chapter than any other chapter. It's when we're taking down the fireplace, the chimney in the house. We have no choice. It is literally pulling the house over. It's a 30-foot tall stone chimney. We have a weekend to get it down while my husband takes off the asbestos shingles from the outside of the house. Our 10-year-old son and I are taking this thing down with power tools, and our 14-year-old daughter is back in the city. And because of a disagreement about parenting and who should be allowed to close up a house and how old you should need to be, when that happens, our house in Seattle almost burns down. And it was a huge turning point for us. We had been doing too much, too hard, too fast. It's the classic American approach. We weren't taking safety into account necessarily. We had to get it done so we would, by God, and that was a real wake up call in terms of how I parented, in terms of our marriage. Everybody really had to start to talk to each other. And we made it through. I mean, that's halfway through the book. We made it through. We're all fine. But it was terrifying to have the place that was supposed to be the safe place. Here was this house we were renovating that was up on cribs that had no foundation. Every time I drove out there, I thought it would have burned down or been vandalized. That's the house I never thought was safe. And then to have the safe place almost burned down was terrifying. Luckily, my daughter returned to the house, caught the fire before it started, and we were all okay, but it came way too close for anyone's comfort. So,
wow, I haven't reached that part in the book yet. My wife's finished the book. What did letters from readers, what were they wanting to tell you about reading that chapter?
I think it's both that issue of safety, particularly right now. I think people don't feel safe. We all feel like our house is burning down, and I think that need for a safe place is so strong. But I think it's also, and this is one of the things that happened with writing the book 15 years after the events occurred, was when I wrote it initially in 2001, when those events were happening, my kids were still young. I didn't know if I'd completely screwed up at that point, and so I think it was a more defensive, almost snarky approach. But writing 15 years later, my children are grown. They're extraordinary human beings, and they turned out fine and better than fine. And I think that that makes it easier as a writer to look back and say, boy, I screwed up there. And I think it's the honesty of that people are responding to when they write me. It's like they keep calling it brave, which I don't understand because I'm just telling what I think is the truth. Mm-hmm. But I think that it is, I think that's why sometimes memoirs are better written very retrospectively, because that's when we learn the lessons.
Yeah, exactly. For House Lessons, it looks like you switched publishers from St. Martin's Press to Sasquatch Books, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. How did that come about, and how did that change your life as an author?
I've actually switched publishers a couple times. I've got, 5 books, now 6 with House Lessons, technically with Penguin. And St. Martin's was a switch because Penguin wasn't interested in Scent Keeper, excuse me, at the time. Sasquatch was because actually it's a fun story for those people that are sending out writing and wondering if they'll ever get published. Here was I was an author with a track record, and I sent out an earlier version of House Lessons, could not get it published. No one would take it. And then a year and a half later, I get a call from an editor at Sasquatch, which is a small Seattle-based independent publisher. It hadn't been picked up by Penguin yet. And she said, I read your book when I was a reader at Ballantine, and I loved it. Did you ever find a publisher? No. And I said, no. But on the other hand, all the publishers had the same, their negative comment was similar all the way through. So I don't want to write that book. I have a different way. And that's how the book became Interconnected Essays, where I really drilled down more into the philosophy. It became less of a chronological memoir and more of an exploration of the psychology of space and how houses affect us, even though it has a strong personal line through it. And so because of that editor, we worked together and created House Lessons. And I am so happy that everything happened the way it did. So if you have readers out there that are getting rejections, it's always for a reason. Hang in there, learn what you can from what they're saying, improve your book. My first novel, I tried to get published for 15 years before School of Essential Ingredients was published. So, and every one of those books that I wrote that didn't get published was what I call my training books, and they taught me my craft. So I am grateful to them, even if they didn't get published.
And am I right that you were working on that first novel pretty much during the same time that you were renovating the house?
Yeah, that's when I started it. And I had up to that point not written any fiction. And I just got the idea for the School of Essential Ingredients. It's a cooking school, 8 students and their teacher. I had taken a cooking class. We had killed crabs with our bare hands. It was the weirdest thing I could ever imagine doing. It was so intimate and so visceral. And I thought, there's a story in this. And for the first time, excuse me, sorry, I do not have COVID. We have fires.
Yes, that's right.
So you're going to hear me doing that, but I'm Good. Fine. Anyway, I had this vision of the stories of each of these characters. And even though I really didn't believe I'd ever write fiction, that I'd ever come up with characters who were people I didn't know, all of a sudden they showed up in my head. And it's been that way ever since, and I am so grateful. I love writing fiction.
And then there were 2 books that followed that it's not a series, it's interconnected stories, although the first and the third kind of...
It's confusing, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you've gotten good at explaining how these 3 books relate to each other.
Well, so what I am most known for, my first 3 books are what you would call interconnected stories. So, for the example, School of Essential Ingredients is 8 students and their teacher. Each student has a chapter. So it's basically 9 stories that are all based out of a restaurant cooking school. And then Joy for Beginners, my second book, is 7 women who are in kind of a cancer support group for one of them. And she survives, and then they all give each other challenges to go forward in their lives, to do things that are new or different or scary. And so each character has their own chapter. And then Lost Art of Mixing is a sequel to The School of Essential Ingredients. It takes 4 of those characters and then adds 4 new ones. So really, Scent Keeper, which is my 4th novel, which is the one that just became a Reese's book pick in February, that is unusual for me in that it's a first-person narrator, single character arc of a book, and then House Lessons being a memoir. So I'm playing around. The book I'm working on now goes back to the interconnected ideas. But it's been fun. Every time I write a book, I want to learn something new in terms of topic, and I want to try something new in terms of either structure. I want to learn some craft lesson. So every time I wanted to move my writing forward.
Yeah. And there was, I think when you talked to Nancy Pearl, you mentioned a literary thriller. Is that still a live project, or did you set that aside for another Interconnected Stories book?
It's in the drawer, as we put it, for now. At the time, I was going to be writing under a pen name to write that book because it was so different than everything else I had written, and Scent Keeper wasn't selling, so it didn't really matter if I switched genres and pen names and everything. And then Reese picked Scent Keeper, and my agent said, "What the heck are you doing writing under a pen name? Stop that." Oh. And on top of that, it was a dark and snarky book, and I think we're all just tired right now, and I think I just didn't need to be in the dark with her. I wanted to write something that felt not light as in fluffy, but I wanted something, a different feeling, more contemplative and less angry, I think. And so it's been very healing to be working on the book I'm working on now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk about the Scent Keeper, Emeline, the main character. What about her story inspires you?
Every book I write tends to focus on something subliminal that is affecting us. I love to make my readers pay attention to things that they have not paid attention to before. So the effect of food and cooking, the effect of those small internalized fears that we have. One of the characters in Joy for Beginners was a perfume matcher, and I did a lot of research into the sense of smell. And it got me fascinated with the idea of writing a book, a whole book, where you got to see someone who was brought up with smell as their default sense, their primary sense. Still has all 5 senses, but what would the world look like if vision wasn't your go-to sense? And how different would we seem? And played with that idea in the back of my mind for years, wrote other books. And then, one day I got this vision of a little girl in a very remote cabin. All the walls are lined with drawers, and in every drawer there's a scent. And I didn't know where she lived. I didn't know who she was. All I knew was that I loved this child, and I wanted to follow her life and see who she turned into.
There are a lot of references to fairy tale in The Scent Keeper, and as I was reading it, and I did have a chance to finish it, do you consider it a fairy tale itself?
In a way. It's a fairy tale for adults. I think that I often I wouldn't call it full-on magical realism, but I like to push realism. And this is probably the most I've ever pushed it in a book. There is an invention in the book that does not exist. It will probably exist in the next 10 years, but it does not currently exist. That can capture, it's like a Polaroid camera for smells. It can capture the scent of a moment with all of the factors of that. And I thought that idea was fascinating in this world of selfies where we have kind of outsourced our memories to digital images. And I thought, what would happen if we outsourced our sense of smell? And should you do that? Is smell a living thing? I think smell reminds us all the time that life is ephemeral and that it has an arc, and that we're not paying attention to it. And so I wanted to write a book that made us pay attention to how much we're being affected by the things we're not paying attention to.
It seems right that smell is so related to memory. I mean, a smell that takes me back. Did you ever figure out, of the senses, is it true that smell seems to be the most powerful way to get in touch with memories?
That part of that is because of the way the brain works. So your sense of smell is, your olfactory nerves are directly connected to the limbic system, which is our kind of animal, more emotional part of the brain. Every other sense that we have is mediated through more intellectual parts of our brains. And so the reaction you have to a smell is necessarily, it feels more vivid, it feels more intense. The reality may not be that, but everyone I think knows, if you have a sense of smell, that feeling of being kind of blindsided by a memory coming out of nowhere. You walk past someone on a street and they're wearing a perfume that you haven't smelled in 20 years. And suddenly, I talked to a woman the other day in a book club, and she said she was in New York. She hadn't seen her sister in 20 years. This woman walked by her with her sister's perfume on. She knew it wasn't her sister, but she said she went back to that neighborhood every day for a week trying to find that smell.
Wow.
Because it brought up so many emotions for her. And that's the kind of reaction that we have to it.
Fairy tales are interesting to me. And in the book, I can sort of see a positive side of fairy tales. They explain things, but there's also, I think at one point, Emeline realizes she's been sucked into a fairy tale that doesn't serve her well in dealing with reality. But when you think of that category of writing, and maybe in your own reading and childhood and all, what are fairy tales good for, and when are they trouble?
Well, and I think we have to distinguish between Disney fairy tales and Grimm's fairy tales, which are very different things. The original fairy tales are dark.
Yeah.
They're often violent. They're a way of helping, supposedly a way of helping children process those fears that, we all have. And I think that's why there's some fairly dark moments in The Scent Keeper and one or two kind of gut punch moments, and because that's what fairy tales do. And I think the difference is we need to remember to see fairy tales as metaphors, as ways of approaching the world, not as the world is. And I think that was the problem. Emeline grows up on a very remote island with only her father. Her life is very, very small in that way. And so, and it's interesting because some readers find that wonderful and positive and relaxing, and other readers have written and said, that father's abusive. It's one of those interesting things about how differently we interpret a book based on our own experiences and our own context. But I think what happens is that when Emeline, and I don't think I'm doing any big spoiler alerts because obviously she would have to leave the island in order for, book to occur. But when she leaves the island and realizes how different the real world is from that, I think that's part of it, is we have to figure out what our early lives have suited us for.
Mm-hmm. How are you reading books yourself these days? Paper, ebooks, audiobooks, different technology for different genre, or how are you reading now compared to how you read 10 years ago? I'm always interested in how an author is consuming books as well as writing them.
Mm-hmm. I'm a paper girl.
Mm-hmm.
I have my e-reader that I call my emergency books. So if I'm on a trip, I always have one or two electronic ones in case I run out of the paper ones. For me, I need to hold the paper in my hand so I can literally feel the weight of the book shift.
Yeah.
And I want to know when the ending is coming. It's not, it's something more physical than it's psychological. I feel the ending coming. I want to feel it coming, which is kind of a joke because my husband actually helped design the font for the Kindle e-reader.
The Bookerly font?
Bookerly is his baby.
Wow.
He was midwife of that between the font foundry and Amazon.
Huh.
And so he always jokes that he makes my work look good.
Is he working at Amazon now?
He's a consultant.
Oh.
It's other fonts.
Yeah. Cool. Well, and do you have any idea in general or with this specific book, when you picture someone sitting down with their book, are a third of them reading it in your husband's font or in the rest on paper, or how are you picturing your readers reading your books?
How am I picturing it, or how do the statements that I get tell me it?
Yeah, the statements, I think. I know which way you're picturing it.
Yeah, I'm picturing them holding it.
What do the numbers say?
But what's fascinating is how strong audiobooks have come on in the last couple of years, and particularly since the pandemic started. I think it's very soothing to hear a book. And I always it's always exciting to me. They tend to send me a couple options of who's going to read the book, and I get to choose. And sometimes it's perfect and sometimes it's not, but it's always different than how I would think I was going to read it. And so to hear that interpretation through someone else's voice is always fascinating for me. And I'm a big audio reader as well. I do a fair amount of driving living out in the country. And so, I love listening to books. And so I also listen to different books than I would read. So, I find you were asking me what format I use, but if it's a very lyrical, character-driven book, I often tend to read it on paper. I want to see the sentences because I want to learn from the structure of them. If I really want to pay attention to plot, like when I was writing Scent Keeper, and it was a more plot-based book, and I was really studying, okay, what makes a good plot? Then I'm going to read an audiobook. Because it slows down my reading process and I pay more attention. I can't let my eyes just skim over the page. And so I tend to read ebooks when it's something where I can skim, because I spend most of my day looking at a screen, so I don't tend to want to read on a screen as well. But if I'm reading a book that it's just a fun read, I'm on an airplane, that's going to be ebook.
It's interesting because when I think of a lyrical book, I think of listening to it, because lyrical sort of suggests song to me, or you like seeing that in print because you like seeing how the lyricism of the book is being created on the page with choices of words and punctuation and the whole sort of the stuff that the writer uses to make the song sing. Exactly. I mean, I write out loud. So I think probably what's happening when I'm reading those books, my eyes are reading those books. I'm getting the rhythms in my head, right, and seeing what is creating them. So when I was an early writer, a writer told me, before you start writing, find books that have the rhythms that you love, the style that you love, and read them hard for like 30, 45 minutes before you start writing. Not to plagiarize, but it's literally like listening to music. And so you get that rhythm in your head, and then it just spills onto the page and you keep going. It's priming the pump, basically. And now I don't need, I've written so many books at this point that I don't need to do that anymore with other people's, but I like to widen my toolbox. So reading those words on paper is a good way to do that. You said you're writing your book, so are you actually dictating a book when you're preparing a first draft? No, I am saying the words aloud as I type them. Really? I didn't know I was doing that until my husband started working from home and said, "Who are you talking to all day long?" Huh. And I said, "What do you mean? I'm writing." He goes, "No, you're talking." It's like, oh, I really hope I wasn't doing that when I was writing in coffee shops, because that would be embarrassing. I'd never heard of that. So as the word is appearing on the screen, you're saying it, or do you say it slightly ahead of when you type it, or the reverse? I think it's the same time. I mean, I don't do it 100% of the time. I certainly do it when I edit, but I need to hear. That's my music, so I need to hear it out loud. That's fascinating. I never heard of that. You should patent that technique of writing. I'd like to circle back to finish up. Your first two books were interesting, and I think they came out of your PhD work and disappointment in not seeing enough books by women. So you wrote a book, 500 Great Books by Women, and then another, Let's Hear It for the Girls, 375 Great Books for Readers 2 to 14, which means you read thousands of books to prepare those books. And then I'm picturing someone who had seen all of these great books. Was that a barrier to writing your own book, or did it somehow pull you to want to join the community that you had taken such a a detailed look at in preparing those two books?
Boy, that's a good question. I had just spent 7 years getting a PhD reading the great books, so if anything's going to intimidate you, it's going to be that process. Because basically it felt like the whole PhD was saying, you're never going to be good enough to do. So in some ways, reading all these other books was the exact opposite in two ways. One was they were women writers when the majority of my PhD work had not been. And so oftentimes they were more character-driven books, and that was where my heart lay. And to see that this could be done beautifully and well, and that this wasn't second-class writing was really, really important. But the unexpected thing was, in order to get those 500 great books, and people, your listeners should know that I had two co-authors, amazing co-authors, and an entire, group of contributors. So it's not like I'm reading all of these books. But, we all each probably read, at least 1,000 ourselves, because you can't obviously include every one. But some of the best lessons I learned were from the books that didn't make it in because they didn't work. And I was a young mother. I had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I did not have time for books not to make it in, And so at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd sit there and figure out how I would have fixed them because I was mad at them. And so to learn to see a book like a functioning machine, with parts that move. And when a book is perfect, you're not seeing that. It's seamless. But when it doesn't work, you get to lift the lid and look inside at the engine and say, that's not, that spark plug ain't working, or that plot twist is impossible, or, and to sit there and figure out how you would have changed it. That was probably a better education than all of the grad school years, honestly.
Yeah, better than an MFA. You sort of created your own MFA.
Well, and I always thought it would be really fascinating to, teach a class on the not quite great books.
No.
I don't think any author would be, flattered by being included in that list. But I still think that we would probably have more writers if we allowed them to look at books that didn't work and, allowed them to understand that everybody writes and rewrites and learns as they go along.
Yeah. That'd be an MFA I'd sign up for. Well, that's great. Anything else you'd like to mention about any of the books we've talked about or current projects that we didn't get to talk about? Or
it's such an interesting time out there. House Lessons came out literally, I believe, on the same day that our governor did, announced shelter in place. So everything just went sideways. And in some ways that was emotionally devastating because I love to go out to bookstores and meet readers and, go to their book clubs and have that kind of human interaction. But the flip side of that has been, well, I've had to learn technology, which is not what I was planning on doing, but also, the number of book clubs that have been created, the way people have used Zoom to get together. I talked to a book club the other day where it was a family where they want to talk every week, but they run out of things to say because we're honestly not doing that much right now. And it's 3 generations, and they choose a book and they invite an author. And I think people feel more comfortable inviting an author into a Zoom call than they do into they're all in one room and this author is descending through Skype or whatever, And the conversations have been fantastic. And I do think that is a real testament to human ingenuity and creativity and this desire to tell stories. And so I am hoping things feel a little bleak right now out there. This is, early September. It's smoky. There's a pandemic. There's a huge election coming. But I think that every time I talk to one of those book clubs, I feel better about the world because it's the best of humanity getting together. And here's the thing I think is so important about reading is that it's a chance for us to talk across our differences because everybody has a different interpretation of a book. And it's because we come with our own context, our own filters. We will each see different things. I like to say we all read the same book. We all read the same words, but no two people read the same book. And And I think that's true. And a book club is a place where people can say, oh, how did you get that? And you go and you look at the book and you read the book and you say, okay, it was this moment. And I think that ability to be open to other interpretations, because there's no one right interpretation of a book. And I think the more we can do that, I'd love to make Congress take a fiction reading course, and learn how to talk like that, because I think that's what's going to save us. I really do. That ability to, not books per se, although I'd like to think that, but that ability to be open to different interpretations.
If someone was interested in having this, what a wild idea, a wonderful idea, a generational book club within a family, or just a book club, they go to your website and there's a way to ask if they could bring you into a book club. And do you charge to do it, or what do the logistics look like?
I don't, and many authors do this. So I would go to the author's webpage. On my page, you go to the contact, and there's a link through to my email. And we just set up a time. I think I've done over 200 of them at this point.
Wow.
And it's been amazing. I mean, I love to talk to readers because I am curious about what they see. I don't expect them to see what I intended them to see. And so it's always fascinating for me.
I've been speaking with Erica Bauermeister, the author of most recently House Lessons, Renovating a Life, published this year by Sasquatch Books, and The Scent Keeper, a novel published last year by St. Martin's Press. Thanks very much, Erica.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Before we go, I want to share some comments. There were quite a few comments about my interview with Joe Lemay, the founder of Rocketbook, and I'll share these. Bruce Kessel wrote, Len, I recently listened to your interview with Rocketbook founder Joe Lemay. While I remember you discussing the product before, I couldn't help hear your enthusiasm for the product. I jumped online and ordered a Rocketbook Flip and Executive Size Fusion with a pack of multicolored Frixion pens. I can't thank you enough for bringing this product forward again. I am amazed how pleasurable the writing experience is with the pens and smooth but intelligently manufactured paper. I'm a huge iPad user with paper-like screen, and it still doesn't feel comfortable doing a lot of writing most times. I recently had pre-ordered the Remarkable 2, but canceled my order because I just didn't want another plug-in device with my iPad and iPhone for that matter. But the analog version of an intelligent pad of paper has really intrigued me. My wife is an administrative nurse and was drawn to the product immediately. I already lost a portion of my initial purchase to her enthusiasm. I'll take that as a compliment. Happy belated birthdays. Our birthdays are close, mine being on September 4th, but separated by 15 years. As you may recall, since I've written in the past, I've listened to you from your launch over 10 years ago and always enjoyed it. I've been an avid reader my whole life. My father and family spent many a quiet Sunday reading all day in a circle in the family room. He passed away a few days ago, and I consider his inspired love of reading one of his many legacies. Take care, Len, and thank you again, Bruce Kessel. Now, that's a wonderful message, especially the image of reading in a quiet circle, and I'm sorry to hear about the passing of your father, Bruce. And Mark Jarvis from London wrote, perhaps a feature for the show, including your experience of digital note-taking and where Livescribe differs from the Rocketbook. Now, this is a reference to a technology that I used, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago almost, but it's a pen, and it uses special paper in a notebook. In that sense, there's some similarity with the Rocketbook. But the Livescribe did something entirely different, because as I was writing in the Livescribe notebook, I could start the recording, and the pen itself had a microphone in it. So as I was writing along on my notes, it was recording. And then the really powerful thing was that as I was looking back over notes, perhaps something I was covering, like an interview. I remember in particular one time I was taking notes in a safari vehicle when we were in South Africa with Darlene and her sister Deb, and we get charged by a rhino. It was very exciting. Well, I was recording it all with this Livescribe pen, and when I went back, I could touch the page on the note that I was writing as the rhino was charging, and I could hear that particular part of the audio. So it's a way of moving back back and forth in the audio. A lot of times as a reporter, I've transcribed interviews, which takes forever. You make a recording and then you type it all out. So this is something that really would be good for journalists and for students, of course. I checked the Livescribe site. It's still going strong. Apparently, the current model is called the Symphony. You can buy it for $109.95. And then the notebooks, there's a single subject notebook 4-pack for $24.95. So, this is pretty reasonably priced compared to buying an iPad or something. And then to compare it to the Rocketbook, of course, the Rocketbook doesn't have... the other thing I noticed, and this might be an update from when I was using the Livescribe, it can kick the notes up into the cloud. So there's a sort of a similar ability to store things that you create with the Livescribe that way. That's the Rocketbook's real sort of superpower, is that you write on these pages, which then you can erase so the notebooks are reusable, and it can very quickly send things up to, I think I've got 6 folders identified in Dropbox, and when I finish taking some notes, depending on what kind of a note it is, I just tap, and as I take the picture with my iPhone, it goes straight up to the folder that I want. Rocketbooks are much cheaper. You can get 7 of the Frixion pens, which the Rocketbooks take, so that you can wipe them with a wet cloth, and 7 pens are only $8.90, and a Rocketbook executive size notebook goes for $30.74, and that includes an erasable erasing cloth and a pen. But thanks, Mark, for giving me a chance to think about these two technologies, and they are similar to some extent and also very different. Mary Butash wrote, thanks for letting me listen to the music for your 70th birthday party. Hope it was a sensational day. I did live stream a jazz band from Massachusetts up here to the tent that I set up beside the house, the cottage here when I turned 70 on August 30th, the Jim Robitaille Trio. And if you have any interest in hearing that, you can look on Facebook for Len's Birthday Bash. It's a private group, and if you request an invite to that, I'll let you into the group, and then you'll be able to see a video of about an hour and a half of this great trio playing music, and they were live streaming up to the tent. It was very cool. I'm glad that Mary had a chance to sit in. And she continues, since March, I have attended over 40 Zoom meetings, mostly about race relations and how we can change the world so everyone is equal. All are handwritten on steno pads. Well, after scanning all of them into my computer, it took hours. I heard you talk about Rocketbooks. Now, I originally ignored your spiel on them because I thought it was the name of an early e-reader. So Mary and I both remember that earlier version of Rocketbook, which was an e-reader, now deceased. Well, even though I was right about that, I listened again. Wow, could it have saved me time if I had realized what it was in March? Well, I'm a proud owner of a Rocketbook now and can't wait to use it. Thanks for the tip. Felicitations, Mary. That's great. Well, that's it. I've got next week's guest is Clay Jenkinson, and this was a recommendation by listener Brian Person. Clay Jenkinson has written a book published this year called Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship, and he also hosts a podcast called the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and that's he kind of channels Jefferson. There's somebody who asks him questions and then he answers as if it's Jefferson talking to someone in 2020. It's quite well done, and Clay is very well versed in Jefferson, which I can tell from reading the book so far. So I'm looking forward to talking to him. In the description of him, it says, Thomas Jefferson was a student of the Enlightenment, of human nature, and of honorable behavior. He applied this to his personal life and to the national and global challenges he faced during the forming of the United States. Clay Jenkinson, the nationally acclaimed humanities scholar and award-winning first-person interpreter of Thomas Jefferson, portrays Jefferson on the program. That's on this podcast. Clay addresses listener questions with answers grounded in the writings and actions of Jefferson. And it says, our mission is to generate discourse between friends and family members which will grow into a national discourse about the topics essential to our country and citizens. So that should be interesting. By the way, I want to say that I had done some serious whining a couple of weeks ago because I had my Echo frames back with my prescription lenses in them, but I had lost the charger. And when I ordered one from Amazon, it said it wouldn't be here till December or January. Well, I got a tip that they were selling the chargers much sooner than that, so I canceled that original one. I ordered one, and it arrived a week ago, and then the second one arrived too. So now I have two of these chargers. That has enabled me to use the Echo frames a lot, and I've learned a lot about them. One thing I learned is that I will not be using them to listen to music while I'm biking. I was doing that Sunday, almost a week ago, through Old Orchard Beach, and I think that just that little bit of distraction to a 70-year-old mind, I wasn't paying attention, and I rolled through an intersection, and a guy made a left turn in front of me, and in those 3 seconds, I just wondered, well, how bad is this going to be? Am I going to get really hurt or a little hurt or what? Unbelievably, thankfully, I was still standing by the time he stopped, and I had a pretty nasty bruise on my shin, and the emergency vehicle showed up, and it was all quite dramatic. But I am forever cured of using my Echo frames for biking. Now, they are great for listening to podcasts. When I'm doing the dishes, I can be wearing these glasses and listening to a podcast, and it's a very simple thing. You just tap the right side of it to stop the podcast and tap it twice to resume it. I think there's going to be some new ways to manage the human technology interface, because when Darlene's around, she can't really tell if I'm listening to the podcast. I don't have earbuds in or anything, and so, you can be kind of rude if you're pretending to listen to a person in real life and keeping on to the podcast. Really, a person just simply touch the frames whenever a human is talking to you. I think that's the rule. And it's also great out on the beach. I can be out there and ask Alexa, when's high tide? I can ask about the weather. I can also be listening to podcasts out there or music. And it's quite a well done implementation of Alexa that now I can actually try anytime I want, because I have two charging cables. So the happy ending to that story, and I'll keep experimenting with these glasses and let you know what I think. We're coming up on 1 year of the Morning Journal. I started it in September of last year. I don't think I've missed a day since then. I don't do it on Sundays anymore, and I really enjoy hearing from those of you who are listening to that. You can get onto it by telling your Alexa device to enable Morning Journal, and then asking for your flash briefings or your news. The commands are changing a little bit, but it's a 3 to 5 minute little rumination that I do each morning when I wake up, and it's become a wonderful practice that I really enjoy, as is this weekly podcast. And I thank you for tuning in and listening, and hope you have a great day. Bye.